Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the third weekend of June 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Established in 2019 by the Franklin News Foundation, the Center Square publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news, focusing on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insights to the headlines. We'll also hear thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist. Today, we'll discuss the riots in Los Angeles and the political fallout. We'll look at the latest on tariffs and the deal with China, and we'll hear about the hurdles still facing the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
He ran for state office and was beaten, started a business and failed, ran for Congress and lost. But thankfully, Abraham Lincoln didn't give up. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the riots in L.A., let's now go to Keegan Kernodle.
Joining me today is the Center Square's California reporter, Kenneth Strutt. Kenneth is based in Los Angeles and has been covering the riots that have been going down, the now 2025 LA riots. Kenneth, can you give us some background for this?
Hey, Keegan. These protests turned riots started on Friday after ICE conducted several operations that day, including of individuals with outstanding deportation or other warrants signed by judges. On Friday, protesters surrounded the federal detention center in downtown Los Angeles, and that protest turned violent when rioters started using hammers to break off bits of concrete from surrounding structures and throw them at officers. Things got worse on Saturday morning when rioters started hurling large boulders at the windshields of federal agents' vehicles as they're driving by. There's dramatic video showing this happen at the moment when a large boulder went even through one of the federal agents' vehicles. It appears that that individual is currently wanted by the FBI and a reward has been put up for his arrest. Things did continue to get worse on Saturday. That's when we also had that very famous photograph by Reuters of a man waving that Mexican flag while riding a motorcycle in circles around a burning vehicle in front of a front line of police. I think that's the image that many Americans are going to associate with these riots. As things continue to get worse on Saturday, very late on Saturday night, President Trump federalized 2,000 members of the National Guard, and he ordered them to Los Angeles without approval from Governor Gavin Newsom. I believe at the time, most of these National Guard members were only sent in to protect federal property. I have seen reports that they are now accompanying some ICE agents on raids. I haven't confirmed that, but it appears that they may be being used for more than just protecting federal property now. But this has led Governor Newsom to blame Trump for what happened on Sunday, which was a dramatic escalation in violence. That's when we saw those images of that line of Waymos. 5 cars were ordered into one spot and set on fire. Those are some toxic fumes coming out of electric vehicles that burn for a very long time and they burn very hot. Violence continued leading on Sunday night, leading LAPD Chief Jim McDonnell to say that LAPD is, quote, overwhelmed and that there's, quote, no limit to what they are doing to our officers, end quote. They, speaking, of course, of the rioters. Videos that day were just brutal. That they included videos of horse-mounted officers being ambushed with flames, concrete, and even those electric bikes and scooters for hire that litter the streets of LA being dropped off bridges onto officers' heads and vehicles below. I remember seeing officers trapped under a bridge trying to escape this barrage of heavy objects being thrown from dozens of feet above them. And the firing of these commercial mortar and rocket fireworks at police. These are large explosives that are very dangerous. This continued on to Monday. This violence, Monday was still violent, and there's large-scale looting on Monday night as well. This included a shoe palace, an Adidas, Apple store, jewelry store, and a marijuana dispensary. Even a sushi restaurant got vandalized. By Tuesday, though, it appears that the city decided it was time to change course. Mayor Karen Bass ordered a curfew for all of downtown LA starting at 8 p.m. Pacific, and the curfews appear to have worked. There appears to be relative peace on Tuesday night and Wednesday night, which was last night. Notably, there does seem to still be some violence before the curfews. Yesterday, LAPD reported that its officers are still having rocks and, quote, commercial grade fireworks thrown at them. I think we should really take commercial grade fireworks to mean explosives, because these are not small fireworks, as you can see in footage of these incidents.
Now, you also reported on California providing funding to these anti-deportation groups, including ones that have organized some of these protests. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. Government transparency group Open the Books reported that the state of California has provided anti-deportation groups with $73.6 million in 2023 and 2024. The main recipient of this funding does appear to be the Coalition for Humane Immigration Rights of Los Angeles, which received $35 million. We covered this group's $500,000 or so grant from the Biden administration on Saturday, really demonstrating that this funding is coming from federal and state taxpayers. It's coming from taxpayers everywhere in the country. California lawmakers have responded by asking for an audit to the extent to which state funding is subsidizing protest and activism-related activities. Chirla, the group that we just referenced, does seem to engage in a significant amount of activism and activism training. Open the Books report talked about the Wise Up program, using Chirla's own website to discuss what this program does. Essentially, I'll let the website speak for itself. Wise Up, quote, seeks to, quote, organize high school students, both undocumented and allies, around immigrant rights and full access to educational opportunities, end quote. And it also aims to, quote, engage students civically to fight in the legislative arena and the public square for measures that ease their access to education and citizenship. Chirla's website also points out their advocacy pillars, which includes challenge anti-immigrant legislation, reduce immigration enforcement, and invest in immigrant communities. The audit letter from the state Republicans also includes the removal defense team that Chirla funds that provides deportation defense, and allegations that Chirla has, quote, materially and financially supported the coordinated protests and riots that have wreaked havoc on portions of Los Angeles, end quote. We have a photo from on the center square of Chirla actually being present and organizing some of these events. It seems Chirla's own social media presence seems to support this. They include recent posts for a hotline on reporting sightings of federal immigration agents. They even on Instagram posted a very long video of this rally in front of LA City Hall, which included Chirla's executive director speaking and directly being followed by LA Mayor Karen Bass.
Now, the Center Square has also previously reported on California's funding for deportation defense. Can you tell us more about that as well?
Yes. Last year, we did allocate $24 million solely for deportation defense and another $37 million for a wide range of immigration-related legal services for both legal and undocumented immigrants, which could also include deportation defense. We have sustained this funding this year. In February, Governor Newsom signed a bill authorizing another $25 million in legal aid for residents, but it's mostly structured in such a way that the majority does seem like it's going to go towards deportation defense as well.
Well, thanks, Kenneth, for getting into this with us. Readers and listeners can keep up with this story and more as we follow what's going on all across the country at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Keegan and Kenneth. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the trade deal with China, let's now go to Dan McCaleb.
President Donald Trump said the U.S. has reached a tentative deal with China on tariffs, and there have been new court rulings regarding the tariffs. Joining me to discuss this is Brett Rowland, the Center Square's tariff guru. Brett, tell our listeners about the tentative agreement with China first and what's next.
Okay, so we don't know a ton of details about this yet, but Trump did announce it Wednesday. He basically said that tariffs would stay the same as they were in the Geneva Agreement, which is U.S. 30% or about 55% total if you add in Trump's first term tariffs on China, plus 20% for China's role in the fentanyl trade and another 10% for that baseline. Those will stay the same, but the difference here is that is on rare earth minerals. So there's a dust up mid-May about this agreement, and Trump accused China of violating the deal, and China accused the U.S. of violating the deal. And then both sides came back together in London. Trump sent his top guys over there. And then a new deal was reached this week. Now, so we have very few details, except that Trump has said that the rare earth minerals and magnets will be upfront. Just how upfront they'll be and how long those will last remains to be seen. It's likely that China will keep a pretty tight grip on those, which are used for everything from making consumer electronics to jet fighters and missile guidance systems. So this is key resources here. But one thing that we haven't seen that a lot of people have predicted is higher prices. Dan, have you seen any prices higher in your day-to-day life?
Brett, I can't say that I have. Honestly, I'm not a big shopper and spender. I do get to the grocery store from time to time, etc. And I haven't noticed it yet, but experts are saying that it probably is coming. Is that what you're reporting?
Yeah. So I talked to an expert yesterday from the Cato Institute who studies trade, and he said that these are coming. He said U.S. consumers are going to bear the brunt of these costs, and that we'll pay for them one way or the other. The interesting example that he brought up, especially on China, is he brought up strollers. He's got some kids. He's in the market for strollers. He says about 95% of strollers that are sold in the U.S. are made in China. And he pointed out that strollers have nothing to do with national security or these rare earth minerals, but it's one of those products that we rely on China for and that we'll likely pay more money for, along with hundreds of other consumer products. So I also haven't seen big price increases in my day-to-day life, but I'm told that's going to change, and it's going to change in not a good way.
Now let's talk about some more recent court rulings, Brett. Of course, consumer groups, small businesses, political groups have sued Trump over the tariffs multiple times, and there was a pretty big development this week.
Yeah. So at first, the Court of International Trade gave Trump 10 days to unwind the tariffs. Trump immediately appealed, and they got a stay from the Federal Appeals Court. Now, this week, the Federal Appeals Court basically said that stay can continue for a longer period of time, and basically ruled that the Trump administration had met the burden to get that stay requested. So, I don't think that this brings a lot of relief to anybody who, especially those small business owners who had filed suit, who some of them said they were going to close in a matter of weeks if they couldn't get products in or if they had to pay those higher tariffs. So those businesses are still struggling, and they have none of the certainty that they were looking for. In fact, now they've got the U.S. court system involved in the tariff ordeal. So it's certainly not providing them the stability that they wanted. But there is some good news for Trump here. Now, his administration had basically said, if you don't grant us this stay, it's going to unwind months of careful, delicate diplomatic work and trade negotiations. So they were able to make the case that they should get this play for at least a little longer. Now, the businesses are super unhappy about this because they say a refund is no good for a bankrupt company. They're saying, that's not a way to, if we go out of business, there's nothing we can do. A refund on the tariffs we paid isn't going to help us at that point. So, a lot to still be worked out here, and there's still upcoming deadlines, and Trump has some self-imposed deadlines at the end of the month. So we still got a ways to go on this.
And that includes, like, with European Union countries, Asian or European Union countries, Asian nations, African nations. So there's dozens and dozens, maybe even more than 100 of negotiations that are still ongoing. But Trump has said if he can't reach these deals, he's just going to self-impose the tariffs that he wants. Is that right?
Yes. So that was a really interesting point. He said that there's essentially 15 nations that they're still negotiating with, on a good faith basis, but that many of those other nations, scores of other nations, could just get a letter in the mail dictating the terms to them and saying, hey, this is what our tariff's going to be, and not even getting a chance to negotiate. Now, most of those countries have a much smaller trade relationship with the U.S., so it may affect them more than it affects consumers here in America, but we'll likely see some effects of that down the line. Just how much, though, again, remains to be seen. And with these trade deals, like none of what we've seen so far, even the UK deal and the China sort of truce, we haven't seen like written documents explaining what's exactly in these trade deals. So there's still quite a bit of unknowns here.
Thank you for joining us today, Brett. Listeners can keep up with all things tariffs and more at thecentersquare.com.
Big thanks to Dan and Brett. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the budget reconciliation, let's go back to Dan McCaleb.
Progress continues to be made on the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that passed the U.S. House last month. The budget reconciliation bill is working its way through the Senate with a self-imposed July 4th deadline for final passage. Joining me to discuss developments on the One Big Beautiful Bill Act is Therese Boudreau, congressional reporter for the Center Square. Therese, there have been several developments this week. Where would you like to start?
Thanks for having me, Dan. So this week, one of the main developments was that the House leaders realized that more like 20 of the provisions, relatively minor things in the bill, violated a rule in the Senate called the Byrd Rule, which basically allows them to use the privileges of the budget reconciliation process. So if the things in the bill violate the Byrd Rule, then they can't pass it with just a majority of votes in the Senate, which is huge, obviously, because this is a massive policy mega bill implementing a bunch of Trump's defense and border and especially tax priorities, including extending the 2017 tax cuts for at least the next 10 years. Today is Friday, and on Thursday, the House passed a bill in a very interesting way. They kind of tucked it into a different bill, but it basically repealed about 20 provisions, not super important. One of them had to do with Pentagon funding, like an extra something for intelligence. But so they passed that. They rescinded those things. And so now it's up to the Senate to add their portions to the One Big Beautiful Bill. And so that's kind of where everyone's looking now. And as soon as today, even the Senate Finance Committee could release their text. And so what we're looking for with the Senate, they could do a lot of things. But a lot of senators, especially Senate leaders, they are wary of changes that the House version of the One Big Beautiful Bill made to Medicaid. So, for instance, imposing work requirements, and this could potentially lead to able-bodied single adults who are currently on Medicaid and not working to be kicked off if they decide not to work. And other things. There's also some phase outs of the Inflation Reduction Act renewable energy credits that there are some senators who their states rely on. And so they're also worried about that. So Republicans are very divided. But so there's many things that the Senate could change, but those are two of the things. And then most importantly, the Senate really wants to make a lot of the tax credits permanent. Most budget reconciliation bills deal with a period of around 10 years. And that's what the House's bill, their One Big Beautiful Bill as it currently is, does, is it extends the tax cuts for 10 years. But the Senate wants more. The problem with that is that, according to most budget organizations, will cost a lot, trillions of dollars, in fact. And so they have to find some kind of way to offset that, which is even more difficult if they are against these spending reductions in Medicaid and these phase outs of the green energy tax credits, because that kind of offered a little bit of offsetting some of the cost. So yeah, it's the next week, there's going to be a lot coming out. And it's going to be tricky because if the Senate changes too much to try to, get enough votes, for the upper chamber, then a bunch of Republicans in the House could revolt. Especially if the Senate also, if they touch the, state and local tax deduction cap or SALT, which the House, they raised that cap in their portion of the bill, but there are no Republican senators who, like that. And it also, again, it can add to the bill's cost if we're taking budget organizations, estimates. So it is really complicated. And it's one of those things where House Speaker Mike Johnson achieved this delicate balance. And he's just kind of holding his breath, he and others, because again, if the Senate changes just a little bit too much, then they're probably not going to make that July 4th deadline.
Let's just briefly go back to the rescissions package that passed out of the House very narrowly on Thursday. Therese, President Donald Trump, he created the Department of Government Efficiency, looking to cut hundreds of billions up to $1 trillion in spending from the federal government. But a lot of courts have blocked those cuts because Congress had approved these spending measures. Was the Precision Act meant to codify some of those cuts?
Yes. So, House Speaker Mike Johnson actually told reporters that this was the, quote, first of many rescissions packages. This one rescinded $9.4 billion from mostly from different foreign aid programs or grants. And then it also rescinded funding for some public broadcast services. So basically, taxpayer subsidized and what the Trump administration calls politically biased news organizations. And so it was a very narrow passage in the House because some Republicans were worried that the cuts to foreign aid could affect PEPFAR, which is the program that the U.S. has that combats AIDS and HIV globally. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said that it won't affect PEPFAR. So, see what happens there, since it did pass the House. And like the budget reconciliation bill, it only needs a majority vote to pass in the Senate. So if that does pass and the $9.4 billion in already allocated funding is repealed, that will be the first codification of DOGE cuts that we have seen. And I think if that happens, we can expect to see, as Johnson said, more of those packages coming in as well.
In the few seconds we have remaining, Therese, it's June 13th. July 4th is not that long away. There enough time to get this done by the Republican self-imposed deadline?
I mean, again, if they all work together, then yes. But that is the question, right? Because there are so many different demands coming from so many different Republicans, and even though Republicans do have majorities in both chambers, they're slim, right? They're slim and there are multiple factions. So yes, it is possible, but it's going to require a lot of compromises, and we'll just have to see whether those happen.
Thank you for joining us today, Therese. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Therese. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. Will Florida eliminate property taxes for some rural counties? Why have Chinese nationals doing research at the University of Michigan been arrested? And how can you better interpret economic data? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits. Some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. Fort Pickett, Fort Hood, Fort Gordon, Fort Rucker, Fort Polk, Fort A.P. Hill, and Fort Robert E. Lee are coming back as names for U.S. Army bases, said President Donald Trump. Trump is gearing up for Saturday's historic celebration in Washington, marking the Army's 250th birthday, coinciding with Flag Day and the president's own 79th birthday. Ahead of the event, the president visited Fort Bragg this week, announcing the name changes, underscoring their commitment to affirming the Army's history. The Supreme Court of Georgia on Tuesday upheld a rule that would allow video surveillance of drop boxes after the polls closed, but said 4 other rules are invalid. The court determined that the state election board exceeded its statutory authority when passing the 4 rules, They would have required hand counting of votes after the polls closed, allowed county election boards to conduct a reasonable inquiry before certifying elections, and permitted board members to examine all election documentation before certifying an election. The last rule would have required caregivers of family members to provide a photo identification when dropping off absentee ballots for someone else. Protests are being planned across the country to deflect from the celebratory events to be held in Washington on Saturday, marking the Army's 250th birthday. The quote-unquote No Kings nationwide day of defiance will take place during Donald Trump's military parade, as the event is being billed by Indivisible, a progressive movement. The Day of Defiance is made up of dozens of progressive organizations and unions, including the American Federation of Teachers and Planned Parenthood. The movement says it is composed of pro-democracy and pro-worker movements and activists. The week began with a historic first, the largest capital investment in Pennsylvania history. Amazon's commitment of $20 billion for data centers promises to change the Commonwealth's landscape for years to come. The first of these two centers will be built in Luzerne County and Bucks County, where the projects promise to deliver at least 1,250 jobs. The news comes a week after North Carolina again landed one of the big five, with Amazon saying it would invest $10 billion towards its Amazon Web Services data center supply chain in Richmond County along the South Carolina border. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug with more on a new property tax relief proposal in Florida. Let's now go to Eliana Kernodle.
Today we're talking about the possibility of eliminating property taxes for some counties in Florida. Joining me to tell us more about this is the Center Square's regional editor, Steve Wilson. Steve, Governor DeSantis talked about this earlier this week. Can you lay out for us what his idea is?
Well, this is part of an ongoing process in the last term of Governor DeSantis being in office, that he wants to leave Floridians with lower property tax rates. Because as you well know, property taxes are assessed about $1 per $1,000 of assessed value. Now, if we've got a real estate market like Florida where values are going up, your tax bill is going to go up every single year. Does it mean that you could sell your house for that? Maybe, maybe not. But the assessment means you're going to be paying more. So what he wants to do is cut into that, because he says that basically, let's say hypothetically, you're a retired couple, which there's a lot of those in Florida. You've paid off your house. You're basically paying the government rent. You don't really own your house, because what happens if you don't pay your property tax bill? They can come in, seize your property, auction it off. He wants to eliminate that. He wants to make it to where if they do levy property taxes, they're actually affordable, and there's limits on the amount of assessments every year. But what he's talking about here that I wrote about is he's talking about making it to where these poor, they call them fiscally distressed counties, because Florida is a very different economic beast than most states. You've got the coasts where you've got just tons of money. I mean, they have tax dollars just falling out of their pockets because you've just got so much wealth. Then when you go into the interior of the state where you have a lot of agricultural interests, you have some small towns, they just don't have the tax funding. So what the state of Florida does is they appropriate money for these fiscally distressed counties. And I mean, I used to live in one when I was working in Florida from 2004 to 2006. So what they do is they supplement these budgets. Well, he's talking about completely making it to where they don't have to levy a property tax at all. And the amazing thing is it would cost about $300 million a year to do this. He's done the math on it. I've looked at the figures. They're about right. Because you figure if you're in a county that has 10,000 people, how big a fire department and sheriff's department do you really need? You don't really need much.
So how would this impact these fiscally constrained counties if they had this opportunity?
Well, for starters, the county commissions wouldn't have to worry about dealing with property tax, collecting it, assessing it. So you could cut some people right there because they gotta have a tax assessor's office. Secondly, I think that those counties would be magnets for like retirees, people on a fixed income, because, hey, if you want to own your home and not have to worry about paying property tax every year, you go get you a homestead in a fiscally constrained county and there you go. So I think it would be good economically for them. But like I said, this is the first part of a move. What he wants lawmakers to do is to craft a constitutional amendment, put it on the November 2026 ballot, and it would require 60% of voters to approve it. That would provide some property tax reforms, make it harder for them to raise your property taxes, county commissions, cities. Also, you're looking at assessments, limit how much your assessment can go up every year, because they've got some Floridians, especially like on the coast, where their property values are going up 10, 15% a year. And that's just not sustainable. If you're on a fixed income, you can't afford to be writing an ever bigger check every year because your income is not really going to change too much.
And you mentioned how much this would cost. It's minuscule compared to the budget of the state as a whole. But am I remembering right that Florida doesn't have an income tax? Do they rely mostly on sales tax? Is that where most of this money is coming from?
Yeah. And see, the thing is, Florida, one of their big drivers of tax revenue is their sales tax. And who pays sales tax? Everybody. It's a consumption tax. And who does it hit the hardest? It's going to hit tourists, snowbirds. You'll have people, the snowbirds will come down from the north, like the Northeast, the Midwest, even Canada. They'll come down for the winter, and guess what? They'll pay sales tax because they come down to party. They want to eat out. My wife's aunt and uncle lived in Cape Coral, which is in Southwest Florida, and they said that the chances of you getting a table in a restaurant during the winter was nigh impossible. You were looking at an hour to 2 hour waits at every seafood restaurant. So obviously that's a great way for Florida to raise money, and it's great for Floridians because it's taking a lot of the onus on them to support essential services. They're putting it on people who are visiting, which I think makes sense. And the thing you mentioned about the state's budget, you're talking a state with $50 billion in revenues. $300 million, as DeSantis said, is a drop in the bucket.
Well, and taking some of that and bringing it to those financially distressed counties where they're not necessarily feeling the effects of the tourism. That's kind of a way to bring some of that prosperity that comes from the tourism in other parts of the state.
It is, because, like, for example, I used to cover sports teams in a place called Hardee County, and the main town there is Wauchula. Wauchula is the home of Ben Albritton, who is the Senate president. But it is not a tourist town. It is a beautiful little southern town. People are nice. It's a great place to visit, but it's not going to have the people going to Disney World or the beaches. So they're not going to have the sales tax revenue that, say, Fort Lauderdale or West Palm's going to have.
Well, Steve, thank you for your insights on this story. You can follow this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Steve. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on graduate students from China facing criminal charges for smuggling, let's now go back to Eliana Kernodle.
3 Chinese nationals with connections to University of Michigan have been arrested and accused of smuggling and other crimes. Joining me to dig into this is Elise Apel, reporter for the Center Square. Elise, can you tell us more about these suspects and what they're accused of?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Eliana. Yeah, so this is actually the 3rd arrest we had announced this week, on Monday. That student was actually a graduate student at, a university in Wuhan. All 3 arrests were of Chinese nationals that were then in the U.S., actually in Michigan, and they came in through the Detroit airport there. Last week, there was the FBI announced 2 arrests. One was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, and they are charged with conspiracies, smuggling goods, and false statements to authorities. And so this is just, authorities have called this a really alarming pattern, of foreign nationals, bringing, biological material into the U.S., to study or who knows what to do with. And that's really their concern as well. The 2 arrests that were made last week, one of those was of a graduate student at the University of Michigan. The other one is actually of her boyfriend, who was also in the U.S., and they were all here on different visas.
And you mentioned there's some concerns specifically about what they smuggled in. Can you dig into that a little bit more?
Yeah, so the arrest that was made this week, the authorities said that it was just of biological materials, related to roundworm. So it's a little unclear, kind of the risks associated with that. The arrests that were made, last week, was actually for smuggling in what authorities called a dangerous biological pathogen. And it's actually a fungus, which causes, something called head blight, that really affects grains like wheat, barley, maize, or rice. And according to the FBI, that fungus disease is actually responsible for billions of dollars of economic losses worldwide, and it can also cause illness to animals and humans, actually. So there's obviously a lot of concern for authorities that these foreign nationals are bringing in this material to the U.S., ostensibly to study at the University of Michigan without the school's knowledge.
And this comes as some people in Congress, as well as the Michigan legislature, have floated ideas about limiting foreign students.
Yeah, so this Chinese national that was arrested this week, like I mentioned, had connections to a Wuhan university. She was actually here on a visa for studying, but it's a little unclear where she was studying. If she was going to be studying at the University of Michigan, it's kind of, they haven't announced that information yet. But yeah, there's definitely been growing concerns about, these Chinese nationals coming into the U.S., studying at American universities, and then maybe either stealing our information or bringing in these kind of dangerous pathogens to study in the U.S. that could then, harm our crops or, harm our, people even. And so that's obviously a growing concern. Of the arrests that were made last week, the criminal complaint actually said that, one of those, she had very close ties to the Chinese Communist Party, and it had even received funding from the Chinese government to study that specific fungus that she then smuggled into the U.S. So obviously lots of concerns there. The federal legislature and different state legislatures have kind of taken steps with proposing legislation to kind of try to address these concerns and try to address the Chinese foreign nationals from coming into the U.S. In particular, some foreign legislation actually would ban visas for all students from China. So obviously lots of growing concern. Lots of Republican leadership has come out and said this, that they said that they would support this legislation. The Democrats have been a little bit quieter on it. But as actually U.S. Representative Lisa McClain said, who is a representative from Michigan, but also the chairwoman of the House GOP, she called it a major national security threat. So this is obviously a major concern for many of our leaders.
Yeah, and I suppose it's probably more likely if there is any movement on this subject that it would happen at a federal level than at the state level because of just the Democrat control in Michigan.
Right. Yeah. The Senate and the governorship are both controlled by Democrats. So even if the House were to pass legislation, and House Republicans, of course, have been vocal in calling for Democrats to support this. But even if it were to pass the House, it would be unlikely to actually make any movement through the Senate. So yeah.
Well, Elise, thank you for your insight on this story. I'm sure we'll continue to follow it if there are any developments. You can follow this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Elise. Listen to Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to discuss economic data and how best to read it, it's Dr. Orphe Divounguy. You and I have been talking about, sort of like, the perception that the economy is changing, at a civilian level. Regular people are now having conversations about the economy. Not to say that we're special people. I mean, if there was a special person on this podcast, it would not be this guy. It would be that guy over there.
I don't know what you're talking about, Chris.
But the bottom line is
special to me.
The bottom line is there is a tremendous upswing I've seen in online punditry by regular folks that are grabbing on to charts, or they're grabbing on to graphics, or they're grabbing on to, little snippets of information. And I mean not to mock them at all. That's not my interest. And that's not what I'm trying to do here. They're trying to make sense of what's going on in the economy, and we welcome that. I mean, in fact, this show was created for that reason. Because we feel like there is a huge gap between understanding, or thinking and knowing, right? So I wanted to ask you this question. If you could break it down into 2 or 3 repeatable things that people have an interest in understanding the economy could do, that you do as part of your professional approach, what would they be?
Well, look, that's a very difficult question. I mean, it's the economy is not. I mean, it's not that easy to understand it. The first thing I would tell people, and by the way, I did a panel on this, recently, is stop looking at a single data point to come up with the full picture.
Okay.
Right.
Well, that's good advice. That was not a difficult answer for you to conjure. That was a great.
I think that's the first thing I tell people all the time is just stop looking at a single data point to understand the full picture. In the first quarter, we had a negative GDP print, and I think we read all kinds of comments about that negative GDP print, including some people said we're in a recession. Well, we're not in a recession. Some people said, it's the tariffs. And I would actually agree that it was the tariffs, but some people didn't quite understand why it was the tariffs, right? And all kinds of, they didn't understand the mechanism, necessarily. And so I say, just stop looking at a single data point. The second thing is try to look at multiple, sources, right? If you believe the economy is not just the GDP number, and if you believe that, because it's not, right? But if you believe that GDP is, approximates output, real output in the economy, then you should pay attention to investment, and you should pay attention to consumer spending. You should also pay attention to the employment picture, right? Output is also essentially, the combination of, employment, population, employment, productivity, right? All of those things matter for whether you see a big increase in output or not. If you have a shrinking population, or if you have falling employment, right, then chances are output is going to fall, right? And so So when people say, hey, we're in a recession, I say, look at the employment numbers. Well, employment's still increasing. So maybe we're not quite in a recession, right? Look at productivity growth. There's measures of productivity growth. You can look at that and you can tell me whether or not you think that's moving higher or lower. And so I would challenge people to look at more than just one data point, one statistic, or even one source of data, right? In the first quarter, we had comments. People say, well, look at GDP now. The Atlanta Fed GDP now is really, really high. 4 point something %, right? So I would say just, pay attention to all those things. And ultimately, the whole story in the first quarter was, if I go ahead and import a bunch of stuff, right, that ahead of the tariffs, right, then, you're going to have, a situation where, your net exports in GDP will reflect the surge in imports. If, you're done importing a bunch of stuff because you're like, well, I stored up 6 months worth of stuff. And now, I'm going to pull back now. I got enough stuff, enough inventory to last me the next 6 months. Well, that's actually going to show up in net exports as well in GDP the following quarter. And so, you may end up with, a number that doesn't look that great and then a number that looks amazing the quarter after, right? And so, just looking at GDP doesn't mean anything is really ultimately the point. I think you got to pay attention to the labor market. And we've done a whole podcast on the labor market. The labor market, top line numbers look good. And so if you just look at the employment figure, employment gains, you're saying, hey, we're expanding rapidly. But if you look inside the numbers and look at the details, you learn, for example, that half of the sectors have actually cut employment in the last jobs report, right? And again, that's just one jobs report.
Right.
You'll have to look to see whether or not the next jobs report reflects a similar picture, a similar story, and where the trend is headed, right? And so that's my advice. Look at the trend. Look at the trend. Look at different sources of data. Look at different measures of economic performance. And if you do that successfully, then you can come up with a realistic picture of what's really going on in the economy.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate your sincerity in those thoughts, and thank you for sharing them. That's I think that's a great stopping point, but a great starting point for people that are out there that maybe you would like to just get a little bit deeper into their understanding of economics and how to do so. So thanks. So that'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it wherever you find podcasts. I'm Chris Krug on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation. Thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.